Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon which part of the world you are in. I want to welcome you to our monthly or near monthly seminar series on behalf of the Lee Kum Shung Center for Health and Happiness. My name is Vish Vishwanath. I am Lee Kum Kee Professor of Health Communication at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. I am also the director of the Lee Kum Shung Center for Health and Happiness at Harvard Chan. This seminar series was conceived as we were looking at the world over the last 12 months or so, with a number of events taking place in the country, and with the turmoil and challenges people have been facing. And we felt that the science of well-being could potentially be useful, particularly in terms of translation, to really inform people and guide and help people. So what is the science saying about well-being, and how is it practically applicable? So we started this Virtues of Well-being series, whether virtues is the right word or not. But throughout the year, we delved into science and practice of cultivating virtues across different contexts, discussing the definitions, measurements, and of course, the impact on health outcomes. We had a highly distinguished group of speakers from very interdisciplinary perspectives, talking about such topics as a sense of purpose, empathy, generosity, and caring and morality in children and youth. So a series of topics that been of great interest to people. So I am particularly thrilled today to welcome to the seminar a close friend of the center, a close colleague who is internationally renowned, Dr. Richard Davidson. Dr. Davidson is the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on the neural basis of emotion and emotional style, and on methods such as meditation and related contemplative practices that can promote flourishing. He's a very prolific writer. He has published more than 600 scientific papers, as well as numerous chapters, reviews, and edited volumes. He has written several books, and a new one is coming next month, titled appropriately, Born to Flourish. I couldn't think of a more appropriate topic for the seminar during these times. He has a global presence because of the work he does. For example, he was appointed to the governing board of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. And in 2017, he was elected to the National Academy of Medicine. He is a co-author of a number of books, including Altered Traits with Daniel Goleman. I can personally vouch for that book. In fact, I loved it so much. I have taken copies of it with me to India and shared it copies with colleagues. And Dr. Davidson also founded Humin, a global nonprofit on a mission to make well-being real by translating science into action. Earlier in 2012, he co-authored The Emotional Life of Your Brain with Sharon Begley, and in 2006, he was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. And closer to home, he received his PhD in psychology from Harvard in 1976. It is such a thrill to invite Dr. Davidson back to the center and have him talk about the work he's doing. Both, he's one of those unique people who straddles across really seminal work and research as well as practice and translation. So, Dr. Davidson, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us and spending the time with us here.
Thank
Just
you.
before Dr. Davidson starts, I just want to remind everyone, if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, question and answer box. We have a complicated choreography. So behind the scenes, our team my colleagues will gather the questions and they will feed it to me. And after the talk is over, I will ask Dr. Davidson the questions. So please don't use the chat. Please use the Q&A box to ask the questions. And I promise you, I'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Having said that, Dr. Davidson, welcome. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Vish, for that really sweet, kind introduction. And I'm sorry I'm not there in person, although given the weather, it probably was wise for me to be here. It's a beautiful sunny day in Madison with no snow on the ground, as I mentioned to Vish earlier. So I'm really happy to be with you to share a little bit about the journey that we've been on and share some themes that will be coming out in this new book that Vish kindly mentioned. So I'm going to share my screen now and make sure that everyone can see this. So I assume that this is visible.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll begin with this inspirational slide. This was a picture taken in 2001. So put yourself back roughly 25 years. This was a meeting that we had in our center in Madison, Wisconsin, with the Dalai Lama. It was actually on the occasion of him coming out to help inaugurate our Center for Healthy Minds. And we were showing him functional imaging for the very first time. 2001, this was the early days of functional MRI, and we were showing him how we can interrogate the structure and function of the brain using these non-invasive methods. We all looked a little younger in these days, and the Dalai Lama was really a major inspiration for this work. So I began my career with a very simple question. And the question was, why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's slings and arrows? And why are other people more resilient? And in the early part of my career, I focused a lot on the adversity side of the equation, studying the brain mechanisms that conferred vulnerability for depression and anxiety and stress-related disorders. And then when I met the Dalai Lama, I met him for the first time in 1992. There was a wake-up call, and he asked very innocently why we couldn't use the same tools of modern neuroscience that we were using to study depression and anxiety and apply those tools to the study of kindness and compassion. And that was really the beginning of this turning toward the positive, and it led to the founding of our Center for Healthy Minds. And the mission of our center is to cultivate well-being and relieve suffering through a scientific understanding of the mind. As Vish mentioned, this book will be coming out. It's written with my colleague and dear friend, Cortland Dahl, and it will be out on March 24th, in just about a month. And it contains really a user-friendly summary and expansion of many of the themes that I'll be talking about today. So I want to first begin this talk with a little bad news. I promise I won't dwell on it, but it is important to provide the right kind of context. And I want to start with um, uh, I don't have to remind you in the audience that our well-being is in rapid decline, but let me just share a few data points. Our dear former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued this report in 2023, which is the first time a public health officer of the United States ever issued a health advisory on loneliness and social isolation. And there's a lot of data that was in this report, and I'd like to share a few key data points. If you look at the figure in the upper left-hand corner of this panel, it displays the amount of social isolation that individuals are experiencing. And it shows that over the course of this period from 2003 to 2020, roughly a 17-year period, there's an increase of 24 hours per month in the amount of time people are spending socially isolated. Uh, and 24 hours per month is a big change in the social fabric of our lives. And I'm not going to go through every panel, but if you look at the panel in the lower left-hand corner, this is reflecting social engagement with friends. And it's showing trend lines over this period. And you can see here that there's a decrease of 20 hours per month in the amount of time we spend socially engaging with friends. And so these data points really underscore how the social ecology of our everyday lives in the US has changed quite dramatically. The other thing that Vivek Murthy pointed out, quite amazingly, is that loneliness is a greater risk factor for premature mortality than is smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So loneliness gets under the skin and affects our biology in ways that are consequential for our health. And these data also show that loneliness is a greater risk factor, is greater than a twofold risk factor compared to obesity in its association with premature mortality. So these kind of data indicate that these qualities like loneliness are not simply subjective states, but they get under the skin, affect our biology in ways that are consequential for our health. Soon after Vivek Murthy issued this report, actually just a few weeks after, he issued this other report on social media and youth mental health. And for any of you in the audience that have children or grandchildren, this should scare you. And these data are sobering. And I'll just show you one data point from this report. If you look on the bars on the right, it's showing comorbid problems. This is an aggregate measure of internalizing and externalizing problems in adolescence. And it's showing the linear increase in the prevalence of those symptoms that scale with the amount of social media use per day. And what it shows is that for those youth that are on social media for 6 hours or more, there's a greater than 20% likelihood of having these comorbid internalizing and externalizing problems. And this is really of concern. The average adolescent in the US today spends about 3.5 hours per day on social media already. That data point was from a couple of years ago. Those numbers are probably greater now. And so this really is reaching crisis kind of proportion. Just a few other data points. This is from the 2025 World Happiness Report, and I just picked out a few countries to compare. Of course, this measure of life evaluation is a coarse and limited measure. Nevertheless, if you look at the United States here, which is in this kind of brown line, what you see is these trend lines over the last 15 years really going in the wrong direction. Whereas other countries like China have been rising. And so this is another data point that is a cause for concern, particularly for those of us in the US today. And finally, I'll end this section with a study that was published a few years ago across the globe. This is a study that looked at 151 different countries and looked at the relation between life expectancy and well-being. And what you can see is that aggregating across citizens in the country and looking at the national measure of life expectancy, there's a very strong association between well-being and life expectancy. And if you compare the data points in the upper right-hand quadrant of this scatter plot with those data points in the lower left-hand quadrant, what you see is that these differences are not trivial. These are differences of more than 20, in certain cases, 30 years of life expectancy between the countries with the highest and lowest levels of well-being. Again, this just underscores the fact that these variations in well-being are deeply consequential for our health and, in this case, for our life expectancy. Okay, so I want to shift now to an insight that is key to this new book that's coming out in a month. And that is that well-being is a skill that can be learned. And actually, the new book has three important taglines that you can associate with it. The first is that well-being is a skill that can be learned. The second is that it's easier than you think. And the third is that well-being or flourishing is contagious. And I will speak to each of these as we go along today. And I hope to convince you that there is, in fact, data that is supportive of each of these conjectures by the end of this talk. Okay. So another key issue is that the same mechanisms that encode suffering, biological mechanisms, including neuroplasticity and epigenetics, can be harnessed for the good and deployed in the training of human flourishing. So what are the contributors? And we've published a paper that provides a framework for understanding this that is really key to a lot of work we're doing these days. This framework was published in 2020 in this paper, the title of which is The Plasticity of Wellbeing, a training-based framework for the cultivation of human flourishing. I'd like to now review this framework, and then I'm going to take a deeper dive once I've given you an overview and share some data relevant to this framework. So the framework holds that there are these four key pillars. The first pillar is awareness. Awareness is about being present, and it includes skills of mindfulness, attention, and self-awareness. And I should say that of these four pillars, two of them are commonly found in many other frameworks for understanding human flourishing, and two of them are quite unique. And the unique ones are really in this framework because of our deep connection to contemplative traditions, particularly from the East. And awareness is one of them. Awareness, to the best of our knowledge, is not in any other framework for understanding well being, which is quite remarkable, given a lot of evidence suggesting that it is indeed associated with it. But more about that later. The second is one pillar that it's found in many other frameworks, and that's here we call it connection. It's about feeling connected to others, and it includes qualities that are important for healthy social relationships, qualities like appreciation, kindness, compassion, gratitude, and so forth. The third pillar is, again, one of the ones that's not found in other frameworks. We call it insight, and insight is about getting curious about how our minds actually work, and particularly um, uh, our understanding of the narrative that we all carry around. We all have a narrative about ourself. It's the group of thoughts and beliefs and expectations that constitute um, uh, what we consider ourself. Um, and we know that at one end of the continuum, there are people that have a very negative narrative. They have negative beliefs about themselves. They have low expectations of themselves. And of course, that is a prescription for depression. But we also know that what's really important for well being initially is not necessarily changing the narrative, but it's changing our relationship to the narrative so that we can see the narrative for what it is, as a constellation of thoughts. It's really what it is. And being able to get that kind of distance and de-reify, if you will, these thoughts can be enormously liberating and helpful for our well-being. And finally, the last pillar of well-being is purpose. It's about staying motivated, and it's about finding meaning and purpose in our activities. And it's not so much about finding something grand to do with our lives, but rather how can we find meaning and purpose in even the most pedestrian activities of daily living? Can taking out the garbage be connected to our sense of purpose? And of course it could be. It just requires a little bit of reframing. So let's take a deeper dive now into these pillars. The first being awareness, and I'm sure many of you recognize William James, one of my heroes in psychology. And as I'm sure many of you know, he wrote a 2-volume tome that was published in 1890 called The Principles of Psychology. And in it, he has a chapter on attention. And he said this in his chapter on attention: the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. And the italics are in the original William James. I think if James had more connection to the contemplative traditions, he would have instantaneously seen that, if nothing else, they provide a technology for educating attention. So we've studied this in many different ways, and I don't have time to dwell on these in detail, but we have studied these in part by studying very long-term meditation practitioners who've spent years training their attention. And this is just a photograph of one of the more well-known participants that we've had in our lab. This is a photograph of Mingyur Rinpoche, who is a young Tibetan Lama who's published a number of popular books on meditation and the Buddhist spiritual path. and he has generously donated many, many hours to be in our lab and have his brain probed with EEG and MRI and other methods as well. And one of the things that we observed in these early studies, and I'll show you a slide from the first paper that we published from this study of long term practitioners, where we measured the brain electrical activity of these long term practitioners. And this is a group of participants whose average lifetime practice at the time we saw them was approximately 34,000 hours. Mingyur Rinpoche at the time was clocking in at 62,000 hours. You can go do the arithmetic at home. These are big numbers. So they've spent a very substantial fraction of their life in formal meditation. Um, and so we saw the prevalence of these very high amplitude gamma oscillations. This is from that paper. This is, by the way, the very first paper on meditation that was ever published in PNAS. And we also saw these gamma oscillations, not just when they're meditating, but during the resting baseline state. The prevalence of gamma was significantly higher than in age and gender match controls. And these gamma oscillations likely have something to do with their reports of panoramic kind of awareness that they display during these practices and during baseline. And we saw these gamma oscillations highly synchronized across different scalp regions. In more recent work with completely novice meditators, where we follow them longitudinally over the course of 2 months of training, this is with mindfulness-based stress reduction, where we can do a true randomized controlled trial. And I don't have time to go into the details here. These are all published data. But what we see is both changes in both structural and functional connectivity. And what we're seeing here, especially, is, excuse me, is changes in the connectivity between the posterior cingulate cortex, which is a hub of the default mode, and regions in the prefrontal cortex that are part of the central executive network. And these differences in connectivity have been reported in other studies as well. And the strengthening of these connections is something that is also correlated with days of practice that you see in the figure on the right. And this is also comparing it to a very rigorous active control group that we call HEP here, which stands for Health Enhancement Program. And this is a very carefully matched control condition that matches the groups, the MBSR group, on contact hours, on homework, and on the enthusiasm of the instructors in their conviction that what they're teaching will actually promote well-being. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about connection now and share with you another randomized controlled trial that we did a number of years ago, where we took people who've never meditated before and we randomized them to one of two conditions. In one condition, they were taught a simple form of compassion meditation practice where they were instructed to visualize a person initially that was a loved one, someone they had an uncomplicated, loving relationship with, and envision a time in their life when they may have been having some challenges, and cultivate the strong aspiration that they be relieved of suffering. And they were instructed to use simple phrases that they can make up themselves, They were given examples like, may you be happy, may you be free of suffering. They repeated those phrases several times, and then they simply rested with awareness. And then after they did this practice for a loved one, they moved on to themselves. Then they moved on to a stranger, someone who they recognized but they did not know well. And then finally, they moved on to a difficult person, someone who pushes their buttons, not necessarily the most difficult person, but someone who is annoying in some way to them. And they did this same kind of practice. And before and after they went through this training, this was 2 weeks of training delivered online for 30 minutes a day. Uh, I should also tell you about the control group here. The control group was a group that was taught a cognitive reappraisal strategy that was taken from cognitive therapy, where participants were trained to reappraise negative events in a more positive way. And they were put in a scanner before and after this 2 weeks of training, exposed to images of human suffering. They were also given behavioral economic decision making tasks that were derived from the behavioral neuroeconomics literature to look at altruism and pro-social behavior, which we expected to be changed by the compassion meditation. So here are data, the behavioral data showing that compassion meditation compared to the reappraisal training leads to greater altruistic behavior. This is costly altruism. Participants are actually donating some of the money they receive from being participants in the study to render a third-party transaction to be more fair. And their brain changes. These are data from the imaging findings showing that changes in connectivity, in this case between prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, predict the magnitude of change in the economic decision-making task. We've also, in other work that I, again, don't have time to go into in detail, we've used both awareness and connection training with teachers, educators, and we were interested in whether measures of implicit racial bias were decreased by this kind of training, which is a huge issue for teachers. And we found in an implicit attitude task for faces, for black and white faces, we found that there was a decrease, and this is a reaction time measure, it's not a self-report measure. We find a systematic decrease in implicit racial bias, and this decrease in bias was preserved for 6 months following training, which is really a long duration of preserved behavioral response. These data were published a couple of years ago. Okay, let's move on to insight now. And one of the ways to probe insight, this de-reification of this narrative that we have about ourselves, is with pain. When you think about pain, we often will use a sentence like, I'm in pain. If we stub our toe, we often would use a sentence like, I'm in pain. And we can ask ourselves, what does this really mean when we actually say something like that to others or to ourselves? Is all of me really in pain? Is there any part of me which is not in pain? We can begin to deconstruct the self, if you will, which is what certain kinds of meditation practices do to train insight. And I want to very briefly give you a teaser of data where we did this in long-term meditation practitioners in the lab. Again, these data were published many years ago now, but they still represent the cleanest demonstration we know of this kind, where we subjected these practitioners to a heat stimulus. We can present heat in a very safe way using a thermo device that's attached to the wrist area, the ulnar area, which is a very sensitive area. It's a 49 degrees centigrade stimulus. And this experiment that we did is super simple. Um, Participants come into the lab, they get one taste, if you will, of this painful stimulus. Then they're put in the scanner. And they're told in the scanner that they're going to get a cue, which denotes it's an anticipatory cue. It denotes that in 10 seconds, they're going to get zapped with this painful stimulus. And we're specifically looking in the brain at the pain network or the pain matrix. It's a set of regions that's well identified in responding to noxious heat. And let me show you what this looks like. So I'll first show you in non-meditators, and this is essentially a cartoon figure that's displaying the aggregated response across the pain network. So the non-meditators come in, they hear a tone denoting that the heat stimulus will come on in 10 seconds, and their brains just get activated just in response to beep. That's all they've heard. And that's all that's happened. And then in 10 seconds, they get zapped with the heat stimulus and they continue to respond and they have a very slow recovery. The long-term meditators, and these again are the very long-term meditators, they come in, they hear the tone denoting that the heat stimulus will come on in 10 seconds, and nothing happens. We find no significant activation in any region of the pain matrix in response to the tone. Once the heat stimulus is presented, we see a big response. In fact, in certain specific regions of the pain matrix, like somatosensory cortex, we see a significantly larger response in the long-term meditators. But then when the heat stimulus goes off, there's a rapid return to baseline. I would like to invite you to consider that this is the neural signature for resilience. Resilience being defined as the rapidity with which you recover from adversity, particularly. Okay, purpose. I'll just show you one data point here. And there's a whole cottage industry of studies that have been published now looking at the relationship between purpose and various kinds of health outcomes. And I know you guys know this data very well, but this is one example where participants are divided into the 90th and 10th percentile on a measure of sense of purpose in life. The ordinate is looking at the cumulative hazard ratio of death, and it's following people who are elders, 70 years old and older, looking at the longitudinal course after carefully matching them for medical history at the onset and showing that those in the 10th percentile are likely to die sooner over the course of this period compared to those in the 90th percentile in sense of purpose. Okay, I want to just spend the last 5 minutes or so of the talk, and I'm going to have to skip some stuff, just talking about the scaling of well-being, something that we're very passionate about these days. So our nonprofit, which is now called humin.org, has developed this Healthy Minds program, which has put into practice training in each of these 4 pillars of well-being: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And it's available freely, totally freely. There's absolutely no paywall. If you go to this website, you can learn more about it and you can download this app from wherever you get apps, and please try it. And it's being used in a lot of our research. It's also being used in research in many other places around the world, including very locally It's being used by Sue Gabrielli at Harvard Medical School in work that she's doing in collaboration also with John Gabrielli at MIT. So it's being used for research purposes. And what we found in two already published randomized controlled trials is compared to weightless controls, participants who use the Healthy Minds program for 4 weeks are showing significant reductions in this measure of distress, which is an aggregated measure of the PHQ, the GAD, and the perceived stress scale. And the data on the right is from 662 public school educators that were participating fully remotely during the time of COVID. And you can see at follow-up 3 months later, these gains are preserved. And this is just showing changes on a number of different measures in a new randomized control trial. And let me just say, this will, I'm not going to give this full justice because of lack of time, but this is a new RCT where we've worked with approximately 830 educators in Louisville, Kentucky, and we did the same thing, and we found changes that we'd expect on these measures of well-being and also measures of loneliness and other and distress. So this is replicating what we found before, but the real innovation in this study is we had measures of student academic performance and other measures of student outcomes by prior agreement with the school district. And I'm showing this really for the first time. These are new data showing that looking at standardized math scores for middle school kids who were the middle school teachers were the target in this work, we found that the math scores of the students who were taught by teachers randomly assigned to the well-being training were significantly greater than the math scores of students who were taught by teachers randomly assigned to a control group. The students had no idea that there was any research going on, and the kids are performing significantly better. And this is really one of the first, I think, hard-nosed confirmations that flourishing is contagious, and that when teachers show up in the classroom and they're more fully present, they are more connected, they walk in with a sense of purpose, the students are going to do better. And so I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and just end by saying that we regard this as an urgent public health need. And we believe that we have the tools now to scale this. And this is something that we're passionately committed to doing. And I should just add one other tidbit here, and that is that the average amount of time in which the teachers were engaged in this training was approximately 5 minutes per day. And so let me end by saying that when humans first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And today we spend approximately 5 minutes per day, sometimes more, sometimes less. But most humans on the planet spend at least a few minutes a day brushing their teeth. This is not in our genome. This is something that we've learned to do. And the data that I'm offering, I think, supports the conjecture that if we spent even as short a time as we do each day brushing our teeth, nourishing our mind, this world would be a different place. So let me end with this quote from the Dalai Lama, where he said, "The systematic training of the mind, the the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable. So I want to just thank all the many collaborators who have worked on this, some of whom are shown here. And if you wish to learn more, please go to our websites, and I will stop sharing and happy to answer questions. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Richard, thank you so much. That was absolutely instructive, illuminating, and scintillating. And we could certainly um, do for, maybe take another 60 minutes to hear more about what you have to say. But we have some questions, and I'll do my best to do justice to them while paraphrasing them. But I have to start with one question that keeps coming up, which about technology, particularly around communications technology. As a student of communication, I'm tempted to start with that. As you know, Richie, when we had movies, we in 1930s with the pain fund studies, we felt that exposure to movies leads to juvenile delinquency. And every time a new communication technology came along, we have been concerned about the negative effects of these technologies, whether it is radio, comic books, of course, TV, internet, and of course now we are worried about social media and AI, particularly generative AI. So I have to ask you, I mean, how do we, as you know, in the last few months, even weeks, and yesterday, day before yesterday, there were a bunch of articles are now coming out, manuscripts around using generative AI and association with depression. And of course, social media, there's a plethora of studies. You cited one of them. I'm just curious, what is your guidance in thinking about these technologies? And what do you think is the best way to really have a framework around both the positive, the functional and dysfunctional aspects of these technologies?
Yeah. So I appreciate you asking that. And let me preface by saying that I'm someone who's certainly not anti technology. I use technology all the time. And I believe that technology is fundamentally neutral. It could be harnessed for the good, but it also could be hijacked to create a lot of suffering. I think that one of the differences between movies in the 1930s and social media today is that we have very addictive algorithms that we have today that we didn't have in the 1930s that have been very effective at hijacking attention. And so the percentage of the waking day that adolescents, for example, spend on the screen is much greater today than it was in the 1930s. And that, I believe, is having a deleterious effect. I mean, the offspring of all the billionaire tech bros in Silicon Valley are keeping their kids away from their screens.
Mhm.
And so the very products that they're creating are, they're personally insisting that their kids not consume, or at least have that be significantly titrated. So I think that it's a huge issue. And I think that we need to incorporate strategies for educating digital hygiene. And they need to be part of school curricula so that when digital devices are introduced, and I've got a 9-year-old grandson who has he doesn't have a phone, but he has a digital watch. And I think that's the age where we can begin educating kids for digital hygiene. And a recent study in the US found that the average American opens their phone 152 times a day. And I think most of us would agree that we don't need to open our phone 152 times a day. We can actually learn to keep it in our pockets. But that requires some real learning. But we can do that. It's very doable. But we just need to strengthen the right kind of circuits and develop the right kind of habits. And the sooner we do that with our children, I think the better off we're going to be.
Mhm. Thank you. I've been thinking, it's not, people have often talk about these technologies, and the number 153 times is instructive. And you see it all the time, right? People are not, even while they're talking to you, they're not looking at you, right? This is what I feel like distracted living, more than anything else. You're walking along the street and staring at the phone. And certainly it requires something else, some discipline at the individual level, but and some kind of a institutional structures, and if we don't have good answers. If we raise this, of course people think we are Luddites, so but an interesting issue as we are all facing. A few other questions have been coming up, Richie. So one of them talks about quality of connections. When we talk about loneliness and social connections, is it the quantity that's important, that we have the wide variety, diversity of connections and friends and family, or is it just these close connections? I have Others have also raised this issue. I keep hearing this question, so I'm
Yeah,
just
I think that
got you.
there are data suggesting that quality, I think, is much more important than quantity, and it's not even necessarily being present with people, but it's the experience of social connectedness is really what I think the key issue is. Um, I mean, some of our monastics that we've tested in the studies with long-term practitioners, they've all done 3-year retreats where they're completely alone for 3 years, literally isolated. They don't see anyone for 3 years, and they're perfectly happy and feeling very socially connected, despite the fact that they don't see anybody. Now, I'm not suggesting that as a model, but I'm simply giving that as a case example of the fact that it's not about being physically present with people, and it's not about the quantity. It's really about this sense of social connection.
Thank you. You have done a lot of work. Your work and the work of others have shown that contemplative practices are certainly can certainly lead to flourishing, thriving, and well-being. It's very well established. Often people ask, but what about, does it apply to everyone? And how do you engage in these practices when you have adverse social conditions and social circumstances, particularly say challenges with poverty or a lower socioeconomic status, or multiple jobs, or other uh, more societal issues that one faces that impinge on individual well-being. So there's a question about, what about these adverse circumstances? Does it still work?
Yeah, I think that it's very important question, and one of the things that I mentioned early on in the talk, one of the kind of taglines for this new book of ours is that it's easier than you think. So, for example, we have data showing that it doesn't require sitting in a formal meditation. You can be doing this while you're engaged in other activities of daily living. You don't have to take another minute out of your day. You can be doing it as you're commuting. And the data show that, particularly in the early stages of practice, the benefits are not at all different when you're doing them as active practices than when you're doing them as formal meditation. We've successfully done this with firefighters and policemen, and published those data. And so it's, it doesn't, this is not something that um, is restricted to particular socioeconomic groups. We've published data showing that adolescents in the country of Colombia who've had very significant early childhood abuse, when the right kind of program is tailored to these kids, show huge benefit. And not just in self-report measures, but even we have epigenetic data that we've published showing epigenetic changes. And so it is a myth that this is something that is restricted to middle class or upper middle class people. We and others have published data showing that even in very challenging circumstances, if this kind of approach is tailored in the right kind of way, it can be enormously beneficial.
Mm. Can I ask you just to on that, try to so someone asked, so a lot of your data come from US, at least what you presented today. And so someone wants to know, is this, are these generalizable to other cultures, contexts? And I know you have done work in other places too, but
Yeah.
for the sake
So
of
we
audience, I'm
just
asking.
actually published a paper that came out, I believe, in 2026, very, very recently, if not at the very end of 2025, in JAMA Internal Medicine, with more than 2,000 healthcare providers in 7 of the poorest states in Mexico,
Mhm,
uh, um, using these fully remote digital strategies for cultivating well-being.
mhm,
And we've seen very significant benefit in these Mexican healthcare providers. Um, we've published data in the country from the country of Colombia showing benefits. So we've done this in different parts of the world. We have work going on in India now. I'm, it's still at an early stage, and there's much more in the U.S. than in other countries. But our aspiration is to really extend this globally, and all the data that we have suggests that similar benefits are found in other cultures.
mhm. We just have about 2 minutes, maybe for just a 1 minute answer. And this is not fair at all, given the kind of question I'm going to ask you. So you have done amazing work over the last couple of decades. Your lab and others you have trained, and other people have done it. So we have fairly well established body of work, which helps us, drawing on these practices and how well-being can flourish. And the Richie Davidson and authors have done a great job of writing and translating the science for the public. But how do we translate it beyond that? Say, how, in a policy setting, do you have any thoughts on that? So,
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I think it's very important, and it does. We do think about that a lot. So, one of the things that one of the ways we approach it, Vish, is that we think about the effects of well-being training in 2 big buckets. One bucket we can think of as proximal effects. So, for example, on measures of well-being, on measures of distress, depression, anxiety, um, those are what we think of as proximal measures. Distal outcomes are longer term outcomes that really are the kind of outcomes that society cares about. So, a distal outcome might be life expectancy. It could be healthcare costs. It could be productivity. And we are beginning to look at that in large scale randomized controlled trials. And we believe that those are the kind of data that have the most direct policy implications. And if we can really show, for example, in a large organization or in an entire school system, that we can lower healthcare costs, even if it's just a few
Mhm.
percentage points. That's an enormous savings, and the cost of the intervention is very low.
Right.
And so I think we will be able to demonstrate a very significant return on investment. We're beginning to do this. So to give one concrete example, this is something that's already published. We've shown that this kind of well-being training leads to greater retention in the profession for school teachers. And we've estimated, using a cost-benefit analysis, the savings that is produced just by the retention data alone. And we've shown that over the course of 3 years, first, before I say that, we found that this was during COVID, where we trained teachers just before COVID. We followed them during COVID. And we found that teachers that went through the well-being training were 6 times more likely to still be teaching full-time 3 years later. And we did a cost benefit analysis and found that for every dollar invested in the intervention, there's a $3.31 return on the investment 3 years later, just from the retention data alone. So
Yeah.
those are the kind of data that I think really have policy implications.
Wonderful. We can go on for a lot more time. Thank you, Richie, for doing that. So let me thank you for joining us. Extremely grateful to you for doing this as a webinar, despite the weather here in Boston. Thank you so much. I
Thank you,
also want
Vish.
to thank. I also want to thank the audience who joined us today. Very grateful to you. We have two more webinars. I don't have the time to go through all of them, but the one next month on March 11th on the Big Joy Project, using daily micro acts to promote global well-being, and another one following that on April 15th about how on the margins, youth perspectives. So please go to our website for the Lee Kum-Shung Center for Health and Happiness to get more information on these programs. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks to my team for doing this. And thank you, Richie, again.
Thank you again, Vish. Pleasure to do this.
Thank you. Bye.